Okay. Hello and good evening to all, and in particular Jad Adams, who's going to speak to us. Welcome to Socialist History Society's last meeting this year. There'll be more in the next year. And it is on Decadent Women, which is a book Jad Adams wrote, and we'd like him to talk to us about it. They're clearly women who have not featured much in any recent debate, so I'd be most interested to hear you, Jad. Jad is a research fellow at the Institute of English School of Advanced Study, University of London, and his many books include Women and the Vote, A World History 2014, as well as biographies of Tony Benn, Gandhi, Emmeline Pankhurst, and of the Nehru dynasty. So you've been very busy, Jad. Lots of work there. And I'll let you start telling us your story. Thank you, Nad.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate seeing you, and I'll look forward to hearing what questions or comments you have after the talk. I'll start to screen share now, and I hope. Oh, here we are. That's it. Now, I hope what you're seeing there is just a picture of the book. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep.
Lovely.
We've got the book.
Okay. All right.
We've got you onto one
on.
side.
Wonderful. We're on. Okay. Now this should. I'm trying to get this to go forward. The next slide. That's it. Yeah. Sorry, that didn't seem to be happy doing it. Anyway, let's start. The Yellow Book was a journal of art and writing published at the end of the 19th century. It was usual in journals for images to be commissioned as illustrations for the literature. So there would be a story published and they'd go and get an illustrator, draw us something that will illustrate this story. Artists didn't think much of this procedure. And the Yellow Book aimed to do something different, to print art on its own merits. Additionally, in terms of the written work, it showcased emerging styles of writing in the 1890s of realism and of decadence. The Yellow Book was created by the brilliant young artist Aubrey Beardsley in his early 20s at this time, and an energetic American writer, Henry Harland. These two, and by extension, the people who contributed to the Yellow Book, held the Victorian artistic ideal in contempt as prudish and lacking in a future. So from the start, it set itself against the establishment. Now, I'm not going to tell the story of the Yellow Book so much as the story of the women who wrote for it, because of 137 writers, 47 of them were female. Well, how did so many women end up on the Yellow Book? It wasn't actually a very promising start. Much of the commissioning and the technical construction of the publication took place amid the smoke and carpeted floors of men's clubs in Mayfair and the surrounding area. This was a serious impediment to women's making much of a mark on the Yellow Book, which renders their eventual contribution all the more remarkable. The first key business meeting, for example, was around the corner from the publisher John Lane's Vigo Street offices. He had a lunch with Henry Harland and Aubrey Beardsley at the Hogarth Club, again, Mayfair Club. Later that week, the first contributors to the Yellow Book were decided on. Arthur Waugh was lunching at the National Liberal Club, 1 Whitehall Gardens. Arthur Waugh, father of Evelyn Waugh, left an account of this. Henry Harland and John Lane had come into this club to tell Edmund Gosse, another writer, about their new project. Waugh was a friend of Harland and a cousin of Gosse, and so he joined them. So here you clearly got a male group of friends, business contacts, and relatives meeting in gentlemen's clubs in which women were not allowed. And all the names of the contributors discussed at this meeting were male. However, despite this unpromising start, women were to be influential writers and in its later years, artists for the Yellow Book, and eventually over a third of the writers were women. It helped that the Yellow Book was a woman-friendly space, even if from the start most of the writers were men. Many of the stories in the Yellow Book, which were by men, were about women, and most of the pictures were of women. So if women's literature is work which is for, by, or about women, the Yellow Book is clearly in that sphere. The Yellow Book put out a prospectus, this is a picture of it, inviting contributions and saying it would be charming, it would be daring, would be distinguished. And the prospectus was answered by women who were hungry for work. In the 1890s, for the first time, a very large group of women left their family homes to seek out work for themselves, to find their own places to live, to choose their own names and their own relationships. Partly the reason for this are demographic. There was a preponderance of women over men in the 1890s of more than 1 million in the UK. These are the census figures for 1891 and 1901. The so-called surplus women problem is represented on the right. So throughout the 1890s, there were more than 1 million women in excess of men, or females in excess of males. There simply weren't enough men to be husbands of all the women who were there, even if marriage had been the desire of all women. For some of them, the prospect of being kept by a man was odious. But anyway, women had to be in the jobs market, or they would be a burden on their families or utterly impoverished. It's also important to think of this time in the 1890s that the ideas of women's rights had been developing over the past 40 years. So there was now a whole generation of educated, sometimes university-educated women, and women had been making advances in the professions, in the law, in medicine, in accountancy. They often were denied the final qualification, but they were working in the right places. The time was right in the mid-1890s for the main movement of new women to the city to work in journalism and illustration, when there was a massive expansion of the print media, which meant there were more publications, books, magazines, newspapers, more than ever before, to be fed by this army of hungry freelance writers. These publications were sold to a nation which was now almost completely literate, thanks to advances in education, which had culminated in the 1870 Education Act. These women were people like Evelyn Sharp, who was the daughter of a slate merchant. Evelyn wrote, "It is family affection, not the want of it, that enslaves the man and woman in the home." She said it was not considered usual for a middle-class girl to have any other ambition in life than to sit at home and wait for a problematic husband, performing meanwhile such ornamental household tasks as were left over when a mother, elder sisters, and competent servants had all had a hand in them. So Evelyn determined to leave. She saved up her allowance, borrowed money from her brother, and carefully made plans, helped by a former schoolmistress. She needed an income, however slight, so she secured a pupil who was the daughter of an architect in London. And she ventured out to Aylesbury Station to take the trip to London in January 1894. And though she didn't know it, the Yellow Book was exactly in that month being planned, and there was no more propitious time to be a woman looking for writing work in London than she was then. When she arrived in London, she experienced what a lot of women did in living in a boarding house. She made her way to Brabazon House, which was a hostel in Store Street off the Tottenham Court Road. And she drew on this lodging for scenes in a book that she wrote, The Making of a Prig. It was a hostel mainly for office workers, with shorthand clerks occupying the highest rung. They worked long hours. Their tea of bread and treacle was kept until 7 p.m. in time for them to return from their offices. Some women were described as too tired to do anything at the end of the day. Some were reading novels, some mending stockings. It was, as Sharp said, a daily routine with just enough money to support life and not enough to buy its pleasures, enough energy to get through the toil and not enough to enjoy its leisure. Sharp's cubicle, or cubby, was a quarter of a dingy room which had been curtained into 4 compartments. There was barely room to move around the bed, and the only other furniture was a small chest of drawers on which rested a jug and a basin. There was a bath in the basement, but the water had to be heated for every use, so only 3 baths could be had per night, for which women had to put their names in a waiting book weeks in advance. Sharp was teaching most of the day in schools, as well as coaching private pupils, and in the evenings wrote in her curtained cubicle at the hostel, using the bed for a table and a candle for a light after the gas was turned off at 11. She sent a story to the Yellow Book and a novel to John Lane, the publisher's Bodley Head publisher. Both were accepted. Evelyn Sharp was to become a successful novelist. Though early in the new century, she had to give up the life of an independent writer, and she had to give up a new lover to look after her mother after her father died. And that was one of the shortfalls of being the youngest daughter in a family. You were expected to take on family duties when there was a family death. Another one of the early writers for the Yellow Book was Menny Muriel Dowie. She lived with her family in Kinrossshire in Scotland. She described herself with her country upbringing as fearless. She was taught hunting, shooting, and fishing by her father. Shortly after he died, she took off at the age of 22, traveling to the Carpathian Mountains in Poland. She took a revolver to scare off bears and a tartan cloak to sleep under. She wrote up her adventures in the book A Girl in the Carpathians, which was a huge success. She addressed the British Association for the Advancement of Science and also received accolades from emancipated women, such as the Gentlewoman Award, which was for some act of womanly devotion or daring. Newspapers absolutely adored her. They gushed about her boy's dress, her prettiness, her cheek, and her astonishing adventures. She knew her way around newspapers, certainly, knew how to get good publicity, and in fact married a journalist, Henry Norman, and they honeymooned in Wadi Halfa in the Sudan, which was at this time, before the reconquest of the Sudan by Kitchener, 50 miles into enemy territory. Dowie's first novel, Gallia, appeared in 1895. The Saturday Review said, "The author has gone further in sheer audacity of treatment of the sexual relations and sexual feelings of men and women than any woman before." Dowie considered the evolution of an emancipated woman was part of the natural cycle, a necessary next stage in the development of civilization, which was thought to be ever improving. Her heroine, Gallia, chooses her husband on the basis of his physical qualities, like a stock trader. Against the usual Victorian pattern, Gallia doesn't marry the man she loves. She finds he has tiny hands and feet, and perhaps even a hereditary heart disease. Instead, Gallia marries a man who has already proved himself fit for reproduction by impregnating a servant girl. So she was mocking the conventions of the novel, as well as the notion that wives should be selected because of their breeding qualities, because they had wide hips or large breasts, whatever. Dowie was enough of a celebrity to speak at the Yellow Book launch in Soho in 1894. She actually came to a rather sad end, as she had an affair with her husband's best friend, who was a mountain climber, and went through an acrimonious divorce where she lost access to her only child, who she didn't see again till he was 21. I'll talk about a few of the other women who contributed. The pioneer of modernism, George Egerton, wrote her series of stories, Keynotes, while literally threatened with eviction and waiting for the bailiffs. She wrote her stories in school exercise books, resting on an upturned tea tray in lieu of furniture. She sent it off to the publisher John Lane and literally did not have a return address for the very positive response when Lane wanted to print it. Eventually, she went to his office in Vigo Street to see what had happened to her manuscript and was welcomed with open arms. Keynotes was an immediate success. It sold 6,000 copies in the first year and was translated into 7 languages. Keynotes, here with the cover by, or frontispiece by Aubrey Beardsley, was about the realities of womanhood. As a Swedish author said, Keynotes is not addressed to men, and it will not please them. There is nothing of the man in this book, and no attempt is made to imitate him, even in the style, which swings backwards and forwards as relentlessly as a nervous little woman at her toilet, when her hair will not curl and her staylace breaks. Neither is it a book which favours men. It is a book written against them, a book for our own private use. Later, Egerton struggled to duplicate the brilliant success of her first book, and she also struggled with an addiction to feckless men that she had to support, though she did have some later success with plays, both on the West End and in Broadway. Gabriella Cunningham Graham was one of the most colourful and well-connected characters who wrote for the Yellow Book. She was the wife of Robert Cunningham Graham, one of the founders and first president of the Scottish National Party, one of the founders of the Independent Labour Party, and the first socialist MP. This was before the Labour Party, when he was a Liberal standing for Northwest Lanarkshire, taking the seat of Northwest Lanarkshire. And he was saying he was a socialist, like other people might have said they were Catholic or Presbyterian or whatever else, or feminist. They could say that as a liberal. So he was a socialist, but he was a liberal MP. Gabriella shared his beliefs and, for example, was lecturing at the Communist Club on the ideals of socialism in 1889 in July. I know because Oscar Wilde sent her a friendly letter apologizing that he couldn't attend as he was dining out. Gabriella, I'm going to read a little bit about from the book about their experiences together, their political activities. They went on marches together and attended rallies. Both appeared on platforms supporting the Match Girls strike. They would both turn up at the gates of the London docks during the dockers' strike to give encouragement to the picket line. They also became known on the international socialist circuit. Robert Cunningham Graham was expelled from France in May 1891 after a speech to strikers who had been fired on by the police. He was escorted to the steamer to Dover and sent back to Britain. A commentator for The Times noted Gabriella's activism along with his. While he is endeavoring to relieve French workmen, his wife is running all over Spain making socialist speeches, which have a great success, rather like that of a Spanish farce. The Times correspondent described a meeting of about 4,000 workmen and socialists, at which Gabriella, speaking in Spanish, denounced the middle class and declared that the English Socialist Party, although opposed to a general strike, was an advocate of the 8-hour working day. Frederick Engels wrote about her after May Day 1892, when she had been speaking on an international platform with speakers from other parts of Europe. Gabriella was a curious person with a combination of revolutionary politics and religious mysticism. If you go to major biography of St. Teresa of Avila, she claimed Chilean descent and an upbringing in France. In fact, lineage was a fake. She was a doctor's daughter called Caroline Horsfall from Masham in Yorkshire, who ran away from home and completely reinvented herself as an exotic South American with a new name, a new accent, and an invented backstory. It was a deception which lasted till her death and beyond. Indeed, the Times was repeating it in 2006. Another one of the writers for the Yellow Book, Olive Custance, was only 20 when she started publishing in the Yellow Book, though some of the poems were written that she published were written when she was a teenager. She was an heiress and a very flirtatious person, both with men and with women, whose practice was to find a poet she liked and write them fan letters until they became her friend. She did this with Oscar Wilde's lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, and they fell in love. Lord Alfred wrote to her, "You are exactly like a boy, and you know perfectly well that I love you better than anyone else, boy or girl. I used to wish you were a boy. Now I am glad you are not." One of the more unusual things that a man has said to his beloved. Olive was betrothed to the future Earl of Sandwich, and it was a marriage that the king had blessed, or a betrothal he'd blessed. But instead, she eloped with Alfred Douglas, to the fury of her family. Olive and Alfred Douglas came to grief after she became pregnant, and she became more rounded and womanly, which didn't please Douglas, who liked her boyish physique. Similarly, when they settled down, he adapted to the life of a country gentleman with shooting and fishing, losing his androgynous good looks and leaving behind the feminine side of himself that she had loved. They separated, but lived close to each other in Hove and saw each other every day. The women of the Yellow Book built up networks of supported friends and accessed women-positive spaces, which developed, notably the at-homes of Aline and Henry Harland on Saturday nights in their flat at 144 Cromwell Road, which also housed the Yellow Book office. New writers were invited into a sphere where they could meet or at least rub shoulders with established writers who were regular attenders, such as Philip Goss, Henry James, and George Moore. So the Yellow Book women had not only been mixing with other writers, but also with a publisher and editor who could commission their work. Evelyn Sharp wrote, "I think no literary youth of any epoch ever passed through a more entrancing nursery than the one whose door Henry Harland and John Lane threw open when the younger generation of the 90s came knocking." She described the gay pink drawing room with its Persian carpets, its pictures, and old furniture. Ella Darcy, who became assistant editor of the Yellow Book, said, "Harland was the most brilliant, witty, and amusing of talkers, the sweetest of companions. Never were there such evenings. Any young writer showing artistic promise was sure of his help, for he was a fanatic for art with an immense A." Darcy's letters show a darker side to these evenings. Ella Darcy wrote to the publisher John Lane one night, scolding him, "I wish you had shown a little more warmth in consenting to see me home last night. Though I was dying with sleep, the Harlands kept me until 1:45, and then, of course, I was spoken to on the way back. It's most unpleasant, because when you're walking about alone at that hour, you almost feel people have a right, a reason, anyhow, for speaking to you." Darcy wasn't being hysterical. A woman out at night on her own was assumed to be a prostitute, and a man might ask her terms. Netta Syrett, another Yellow Book writer, wrote of a time returning from a different house, but also in West London, when she was taken to be a working girl by a policeman who propositioned her. The publisher, John Lane, may well have been having a relationship with Darcy, which is why she spoke to him in such familiar terms. Lane, one of the key figures in the lives of literary women in the Yellow Book, said, probably enjoyed his literary group all the more because of his experience of a very different kind of life. He was born in Devon in 1854 and went as a teenager to London to find work as a clerk in the railway clearinghouse at Euston Station, which work he did for more than 20 years. And then he set up his shop at 6B Vigo Street, publishers and vendors of choice and rare editions in Belles Lettres. This is a picture of from the Yellow Book, and on the right, one I took quite recently. John Lane liked women so much that he was called Petticoat Lane. A fellow publisher described Lane's methods. To some of the least sophisticated of his ladies, he would endear himself by taking them round the corner from Vigo Street and giving them lunch at a restaurant a few doors down Sackville Street. And they would come away and praise him and his lunch, and musing on the excellence of his champagne, would say they had paid little attention to the details of the agreements they had signed. Indeed, he didn't actually give them champagne. It would be Asti Spumante, but he had a trick of turning the label away from the person he was dining with, so they didn't know. He was mocked in newspapers for his fondness for women and his tendency to employ a lot of women as writers. One of the newspapers had a verse which went, "The hearts of women throb and beat for Mr. Lane in Vigo Street." Ella Darcy wrote to him in familiar terms, "I expect you are having a good old time with tea parties every day, and Evelyn Sharp and Netta Sirat and the weirdly beautiful Victoria Cross forever popping in upon you what it is to be a popular publisher." The thing about the tea parties, however, was that having tea at a house in Mayfair was exactly what women should be doing. They couldn't meet and be engaged in literary life in other areas, so it was a boon to be able to go to one of John Lane's tea parties and talk about books. The arrest of Oscar Wilde in spring 1895 dealt a blow to the Yellow Book, because though Wilde had never contributed, he was associated with decadence, as was the Yellow Book, so the journal was guilty by association. The arrest of Oscar Wilde was at a difficult time in the production of the Yellow Book. Issue 5 was ready to go to the printers. The publisher, Lane, had gone to New York, and the editor, Harland, had gone to France. Ella Darcy was in charge of the final touches. However, some of the writers who Lane published were concerned about being associated with Wilde and called for the removal of Aubrey Beardsley's work from the Yellow Book. So if for those who believe that cancelling is something modern or something woke, have probably been watching the wrong TV channels, because these people were saying, we want to cancel Aubrey Beardsley. We want his work taken out. We want his work to be removed from the Yellow Book, him to be sacked as art editor. And John Lane didn't feel he could lose these writers, and so he telegrammed for this to happen. And it fell to Ella Darcy to find new prints to put in place of the missing Beardsleys. She did that and saved the Yellow Book to fight again. It may have lost Beardsley, but as far as women illustrators in the Yellow Book went, Beardsley's departure was no bad thing. Beardsley liked drawing women. Here are a couple of his illustrations for the Yellow Book. 27 of his 31 illustrations in the Yellow Book are of women. He didn't like employing them so much. In the last 5 issues under Beardsley's direction, 84 works of art were commissioned, and only 1 was by a woman. In the subsequent 8 volumes, not under his control, there were 20 illustrations by women. So the disappearance of Beardsley from editorial control had made the Yellow Book altogether a more woman-friendly production. Mabel Dearmer was the first woman to draw a Yellow Book cover. That's her and her cover. Harland had written in his whimsical way about dog and cat literature, dog literature being popular, but poorly written. while cat literature was beautiful if less commercial. He wrote, "The cat is always a princess, because everything nice in this world, everything fine, sensitive, distinguished, everything beautiful, everything worthwhile, is of essence feminine, though it may be male by accident of sex." In volume 10, in which he wrote this, women outnumbered men as contributors for the first time. There were 9 women out of 15 writers, and an equal number of male and female illustrators. 2 of the women illustrators were sisters of one of the writers, of Netta Siret. That's Netta Siret on the left, and we see here displayed the paradox of illustrators. It's normally easy to find pictures of writers, but much more difficult to find pictures of illustrators. So I'm illustrating Nellie Siret and Mabel Siret with the covers which they drew. These sisters all lived together in a flat in Westminster. 2 of Nellie and Mabel were art students. And another one of the sisters acted as a housekeeper for them. This setup of young women living together in a flat was so unusual that there was a book published at the time called simply 3 Girls in a Flat, which examined this phenomenon. The doors of Lane and Harland may have been open, but other publications proved harder to crack. Ella Hepworth Dixon, another Yellow Book writer, wrote of waiting outside an editor's office, not the Yellow Book editor, but a different one, and witnessing an editor and a young man smoking and laughing. And she waits before the editor's visitor departs, promising, "See you at the club tonight," a club in which she will never set foot. The literary market was weighed against them. Through the occasional mistakes where women are accidentally regarded as men, the different standard is exposed. Evelyn Sharp received an invitation to Mr. Evelyn Sharp, because the name is epicene, could be male or female. The invitation was to a smoking evening for a book club. This invitation was hastily revoked when it was realized that a female was being addressed, so she was denied the opportunity of this networking. Similarly, an editor's frank statements to George Egerton about her manuscript were later withdrawn with, "It shocked me when I learned that you were a woman, and thought of what I had written under the full belief that I was addressing a man. It never once dawned on me that the author of those virile sketches was not one of my own sex, or I would never for a moment have written as I did." Such errors indicate how the drawing room niceties of Victorian Britain were a serious constraint on candid discussion in the literary world, and how much was concealed from women writers, even in direct discourse. Such neglect or deliberate exclusion of women continued throughout their careers and after. Women generally didn't have the college relationships of men. They usually lacked the working relationships as they were new to the workforce. And a respectable woman could not meet with men in pubs like the Crown in Charing Cross Road, where decadents and aesthetes and theatre people would meet. Women formed their own groups, of course. The habits of literary women were a source of fascination for the press, where they were often seen not as independent agents, but as would-be men. The Northern Echo thus reported on a woman's gathering, which included many Muriel Dowie and other Yellow Book women. Literary ladies who, copying a masculine custom, dined together at the Criterion. A well-known publisher had sent a box of cigarettes, which were duly smoked by several of the ladies. Decidedly, the gentler sex is getting on. The Yellow Book was closed finally because it had stopped making money. Once it had been ahead of the field, then there were so many imitators, it was no longer alone. Henry Harland was ill and was going to die soon in the 20th century, the new century, and was unable to give up his best. So it ran for only 13 volumes between 1894 and 1897, but has frequently been reprinted, and is always referenced in histories of the times, such as that the 1890s are sometimes called the Yellow 90s in reference to the Yellow Book. The women's careers continued. Some, like Netta Sirat, wrote more than 50 books. They were very different people, but had the Yellow Book in common, and arguably decadence. There were new currents in the 20th century. The suffragettes, as the Women's Social and Political Union, started in 1903. There was only one fully committed hunger-striking suffragette among the Yellow Book women. That's Evelyn Sharp. She's the one holding the poster right in the middle. Sharp also went to Russia after the revolution and to Germany after the First World War to report on the famine there for the Manchester Guardian. Some contributors to the Yellow Book were wealthy and just got on with their lives after the demise of the publication. Gabriella Cunningham-Graham and Olive Custance lived on country estates in Scotland and Norfolk, respectively, when they were not at their houses in London. At the other end of the scale, Ella Darcy, who had 10 stories in the Yellow Book, more than almost anyone else, and who acted as deputy editor of the Yellow Book, at the end of her life lived in one room in Paris and died in a workhouse hospital ward in the St. Pancras Institute. One of the women I studied went to war. In World War I, Mabel Dearmer's last book was Letters from a Field Hospital. She went to serve in the Serbian medical unit after finding that her husband, both sons, and her lover had joined up in 1914. She died of enteric fever in 1915 and is distinguished as being one of the few women to have a war memorial erected to her memory. This is it in Oakridge, Gloucestershire. 3 women following the theme of war. 3 women were bombed out of their homes in World War II: Evelyn Sharp, George Egerton, and Ethel Colburn Mayne. And I'll finish with some words from Ethel Colburn Mayne, who had been invited from Ireland to London to become literary editor on the Yellow Book, on the quality of her work and the ideas expressed in her letters. And she was still writing and still making a living from writing in the 1940s. Ezra Pound asked her to give some words on the Yellow Book for his publication, The Little Review. And she wrote, "You found yourself in the enchanted place and never knew how you got there. Was it better than the real place? You often thought it was. And people told you you were decadent, that was decadence, to find the words about it better than the thing itself. You said you didn't care. If this were decadence, you were glad to be a decadent. It was a time, believe me, worth the living in." Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's it. Greta, you're muted.
Okay, here we are. Jad, that was very interesting. Thank you very much. Marvelous to hear this, the way you're relating the story with all the detail. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm sure there'll be people who would like to know lots more. Actually, what I didn't find out, or maybe I've forgotten about it, why were they called Yellow Book? Why was it called Yellow Book?
It was called Yellow in reference to yellow novels. French novels were bound in yellow paper, and French novels were considered risque. In fact, many of them were risque, and so they wanted to be associated with French decadence and with French culture.
Yeah, thank you. That in a way points the way for why the decadence sort of came into it, and people talked about and were maybe proud to be part of a decadence. You just wonder where the word decadence comes from. Obviously, it comes from decayed somewhere, but has changed the meaning. So let's see if there are any direct questions coming up. There, I think what occurs to me is the time you talked about when the arrest of Oscar Wilde was very bad for yellow books. Was it only because of the association with Aubrey Beardsley as well as Wilde, or was something else also an aspect of that?
Beardsley had illustrated Wilde's work. It illustrated Salome, so there was a supposed association, though the two men didn't actually like each other. And as I said, Oscar Wilde hadn't contributed to the Yellow Book. But basically, once Wilde, who was the leading writer of the time, who was associated with the Decadent movement, once Wilde had been brought down, it was open season on the Decadents, and they all had trouble getting their work published.
Yeah, so in a way, decadence had started, and there was a kind of a backlash, which fits what when would that have been? Was it still in the 19th century, or was it beginning of 20th century?
No, so it's from April, May 1895, which was the trial of Oscar Wilde, well, the three trials, which he was involved.
Yeah. Okay, we've got John Blewett wanting to ask a question, and David Morgan afterwards. So John Blewett first.
Thank you very much for your talk. I found it really interesting. Do you know how large the readership was of the Yellow Book, and who were the readers?
Well, the readers were generally people who had money in their pockets, because each copy of the Yellow Book cost 5 shillings. And you could get a journal, another literary journal, for 6pence. So this is a huge difference. So you could, and so it was definitely an educated group of people. There's a picture by a woman called Gertrude Hammond of a young man showing a young woman a copy of the Yellow Book, as if he's in a Victorian drawing room, as if he's encouraging her to be naughty. And that's the suggestion. I think young people, at least young people who had some money, were the people who were most enthused by the Yellow Book. Those that they really felt this is for us. But as I say, it had to be people who had a few pounds to spend. But all publications tended to get read by lots and lots of people, get passed on and passed on.
Okay, that's very interesting, the difference between the cheap journals like at a couple of shillings or so, or pennies, and 5 shillings. So it's quite a sharp price upward there. David, would you like to say something? David, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I can't see myself, so I hope I can seen. Can I be seen?
And not at the minute.
Anyway,
no.
Oh, it's not necessary anyway. I've got a couple of questions. First of all, maybe you can say something about how people were paid who wrote the journal. Was it good pay, or was it comparative to other journals? Was it good pay? Did the women contributors depend on that as a salary, or did they have various other professions as well? I mean, you said some were quite wealthy and possibly didn't need the income. Also about Beardsley, I know if looking at the illustrations you gave, it seems that Beardsley was quite important to the start of the journal. His very distinctive style, which is obvious from the selection you've given there. And Beardsley was very young when he passed away. He was a phenomenon, in fact. And we should forget, Beardsley wasn't a very, very wealthy person. He struggled a lot with his illness and also his family responsibilities for his sister and mother. And he didn't come from a very, very wealthy background. So I wanted to also ask, was there any working class people who would have read the Yellow Book, or was that what people like socialist movement? What did you think of it? Like maybe Bernard Shaw, or did you have any opinions on it? And what is the lasting legacy of the Yellow Book, if there is one, for literature in English writing English? Or maybe internationally? Was it taken up internationally in a sense? Because you say that they took the title from France, and Decadence sort of was connected to France, so French culture. But was there any French influence on the style of the Yellow Book? Anyway, cross-cultural interactions. Maybe could say something about that. And I think I'll stop there. You don't have to answer all those. It's just some of the ideas that came into my head as you were speaking. Thank you.
No, okay, well, all very interesting. How are people paid? It depended. If you contributed a poem, if it's a short poem, you get paid much less than for a long poem. People did rely on working on writing for a living. And so people like Seirat, who I mentioned a few times, was definitely reliant on her income from the Yellow Book and other publications. It was very hard to live on what you made just from the Yellow Book itself. If you wrote a story for the Yellow Book, I've got Ella Darcy always complaining about not being paid or not being paid enough, and she's getting £15 for a story, which is a reasonable sum if she's able to supplement that with lots of other bits of money from other writing work. So some people definitely did depend on it. Others, as you say, no. Beardsley, while Lane kept to the letter of his agreement to remove Beardsley from the Yellow Book as art editor, but he didn't stop using Beardsley. Beardsley continued to contribute to John Lane's publications, to Bodleyhead Publications, and was getting other commissions, and started working with other publishers. So, as you say, he was never rich, but he was never actually in penury. Oh, I can't remember the next thing that
French influences.
Yeah, French influence, and yeah, French influence on some. Henry Harland was very, very much influenced by French writers, and other people who wrote for the Yellow Book tended to be influenced by French writers. Some were taking things much further. Ethel Colburn Mayne, whose quote I finished with, was a very important modernist before Joyce, before Virginia Woolf, and she was taking things in her own direction. And similarly, George Egerton were important modernists, and they owed nothing to the French at all. There tended to be a bit of a division here, in that the men looked to France and often went to France, often visited Paris, and there was a lot in Paris for them, the literary scene and a much easier sexual scene than there was in Victorian London. While the women tended to look to Scandinavia, to go to Norway, where there was a climate which had encouraged the work of Ibsen, for example, and Ola Hansen in Sweden, and other writers and thinkers who were putting women more towards the center of life. And in fact, it was in the Scandinavian countries that women first got the vote in Europe. And so Scandinavia was just more woman friendly. So from my point of view, what I was interested in is the women going to Scandinavia rather than France. Though some did go to France. Internationally, it from about the fourth issue of the Yellow Book, it started printing on the cover the price in pounds or shillings, in fact, and in dollars, because they were selling in the US. So it was an influential publication in the United States. And when I said at some time Lane was off at a key moment, was off in the United States, that's because he was setting up an office in New York, because he was his publishing company had become successful enough, and the market in the US was big enough for him. So that was that was certainly an international effect, and other people were copying the Yellow Book or producing their own kind of decadent publication. Evergreen is one, which was published in the 1890s. The Evergreen, which was published in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Jad.
Thank you.
Francis, did you want to come in?
Yes, thanks, Joe. Fascinating. What I was wondering about, as you were telling us about all the young, and they were nearly all young women who were writing for the Yellow Book, what was the profile of the men who were writing for the Yellow Book? Was this a publication of older men and younger women, or was it a publication which on a kind of equal opportunities basis gave a chance to new and up and coming writers? In other words, was it just the sort of people that John Lane liked having in his house, or was it, did it also launch the careers of a number of younger male writers as well?
Right. There were some older writers. So Henry James contributed to the first edition, for example, and would often attend those parties that the Harlands would have. And there were some people who were young writers, like Hubert Crackenthorpe, whose wife Lila Crackenthorpe also contributed to the Yellow Book. So they were the Crackenthorpe was young. It would generally be a mix of the youthful and the older, particularly because Lane could pay the younger ones less because they were more eager to get publication. And some people certainly got publication at the beginning of their careers, like H.G. Wells was published in the Yellow Book, for example, and W.B. Yeats was. So people were getting some publication early on when they needed it, and who later went on to become famous. So it was a mix, and Harlan tried to attract people as widely as possible. But as you say, the women were generally young, because women were new to the writing, this sort of writing marketplace.
Actually, could I ask, I don't know, you may have said that, but did Harlan, I mean, in how far was it the rush of women coming forward to write and earn a living through writing? Or in how far was it Harlan actually wanting to embrace women writers? Because obviously they were starting something new, okay, and they were aligning themselves with the French decadent women or something. But did he actually, how much was it the pressure from the women that they really just stormed in and wanted to be published, and they obliged themselves to do it? And how much was it them actually really wanting to have women writing?
Well, there are numerous examples of Harlan going really out of his way in order to meet women, to see women who had written to him or contributed something. Like Ella Darcy, for example, I found a letter showing that Harland had gone to see her in Hythe in Kent, which is where she was staying. They had a family, some members of a family had a home there, which is quite a journey to make in the 1890s. So he went to see her after she had written to him. He invited Ethel Colburn Mayne to come and work on the Yellow Book after she'd been corresponding with him from Ireland. Charlotte Mew, the poet, I've got him coming, inviting her to his home, to the Yellow Book office, and talking to her about her writing career. So he was very interested in encouraging writers. I think they had to first approach him, though. I don't think that he was saying, now we're going to have women. I think he was pleasantly surprised that so many women came forward and recognized that they needed particular encouragement and that there were particular impediments against being a successful woman writer that there weren't against being a successful man writer. These issues of being able to network and places where women were allowed to go, the sort of things editor would say to them, that kind of thing. So I think Harland recognized that and tried to make amends, tried to fill in that space.
That's very, very good. I mean, it was something new. I can't see at the minute. I don't know. Let me ask people to join at the end, if you would. That's Steve Cushion. Okay, Steve Cushion is going to come at the end. But I'm still, I mean, it's very good how you report how the two people who found out that the women they'd invited were women and not men, George and Evelyn. It's of course marvelous to have a name that could be both male and female, and they were disinvited. It's, although of course we know all this has gone on, it is always a shocking experience to find that it can actually be outspoken. It can be so in your face that just because you're a woman, you're not acceptable. You can't be asked. You have to be disinvited. It's so I really appreciate you talking about that and bringing it home again. What a struggle it's been. And
Thank you.
actually just, yeah. So, I mean, I really appreciate that from you. I mean, I do want to mention, you mentioned Virginia Woolf, and I do like her book, A Room of Our Own. And I mean, she does portray marvelously, I think. I mean, I'm also a writer, I write novels. And what she's saying is really important, that men, of course, can base themselves on a whole long history of names, right back to what Chaucer, Shakespeare, and all the many, many names go earlier, Plato, Aristotle, and so on. And women on the whole can't, and how very difficult it is. And you did talk about that. For a woman to develop a writing style that it will actually be something else, you've told us, will be her own writing style, not something copied by men, and how you have to develop it in a way, because women haven't been featuring in the arts really, in painting, writing, in composition. Composers are more or less the last sort of art form that women joined, and how very much hard work it is for those women to develop a new style for themselves.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I agree with all of what you said. I think that the principal difficulty was the matter of networking, of being able to of having all these contacts via family and via and via working relationships that men had and could constantly refresh their relationships. So, for example, I've got a letter from George Egerton where she's saying to one man, she's correcting some error that she feels he's fallen into. He's misunderstood her in something, and she says, "I'm sorry to be writing this to you. If I were a man, I'd be seeing you all the time." But she didn't want to let it go, and so she felt that she had to write a letter. But it shows that she's taking it a bit further, where had she just been another man, should have said, "Oh, I wanted to say this to you, old chap," whatever.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And she's apologizing. It's another thing
Yeah.
that women do. I apologize. I'm sorry. Yeah, so it's a really it's wonderful to listen to your stories of what you've dug up there with all the details, the letters, and where people lived and how they did manage to come forward and do some work. Is I think it's very I appreciate it very much. Does somebody else, the other people who would like to make a contribution? I'm just looking. One's individual woman
I've
got
got
a
Victoria Davidson
Oh yeah,
in the chat here,
yeah.
saying, "Once individual women got a foot in the door, did they hold it open for other women? How much did they network and so on?" Well, they did to some extent. I've got sort of 3 women who continued to be friendly with each other and to help each other. But there was also the other thing. I mean, there were people who, like Ella Darcy, felt that she was the queen of the Yellow Book. She was there, and she didn't want to encourage anyone else. And when Ethel Colburn Mayne was invited in to join the team, Darcy made things so unpleasant for her that she had to leave. And then Darcy, when she had control of the magazine at one time, actually took one of Ethel Colburn Mayne's stories out and gave it to the proof and gave it to the printer without. So I mean, that's how far she would go to be destructive of another woman. But others at other times, of course, there were other people who were extremely positive and helpful to each other. But actually having good friends doesn't help that much unless your friends actually occupy an editorial position. They needed people who were in charge, and that was when the real change came. It wasn't that you had individual great journalists. I mean, there were very good journalists working on national papers at this time, but once their tenure had ended, then it didn't help women at all. Just that there had been a woman who once had a job as a foreign correspondent, and she did very well in it. It didn't mean anything. What made the real difference was once you started having women in editorial positions who had the power to hire and fire. Commission, of course.
Actually, you do mention the other called the Lurid sisters who did the artwork. The whole I mean, 3 of them did the artwork and 1 looked after them. So I
Yes.
thought that was a nice example of women supporting other women and helping each other.
Yes, certainly. They had rather an enlightened father, I think, who managed to get that flat for them in Westminster. But it was one writer and 2 illustrators. They were students. I think the idea was they're going to be studying in London anyway, and Netta was going to be working in London. So it's best if they're all living in one place, looking after each other.
Fantastic. Very good. Okay. Looking for certainly it's very difficult for people. Oh yeah, we don't have subtitles here. That is true. Okay. If there are, I'm looking at the time. If there are no other questions asked and contributions, we're going to ask Steve to come in with a little message, where I think he might say amongst themselves, if you would like to join the Socialist History Society and help build up also the women in the society, because as you know, history is also very much a male subject, as many others, but history, of course, very important, because we're telling the stories of how people live and how they die, obviously in wars and so on. And if it's only men who tell the story, we only get the idea from men. So we do need women, we need men, we need people in the History Society. So you may say more about that and something else. So where is he? Steve, are you there? Oops. How to join? Okay, okay, he's just put it up there. There's Steve.
And I also muted myself, and then I couldn't work out how to unmute it. Well, that was up. Yes, so if you want to join the Socialist History Society, go to the website, socialisthistorysociety.co.uk. You will find a page, join. All the instructions are available there. And it costs £30 a year UK, and £40 a year Europe online, and £40 for the rest of the world. You can join with PayPal, you can join by post, or by bank transfer. Any way you want to join, you'll be more than welcome. We need people to join. As Greta says, we need men and women. We need writers for the journal, and so on. So please think about joining, and we hope to welcome some of you then. And of course, you'll be always welcome to our public Zoom meeting. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anyone who does join will be joining for 2024, but we'll get the last publication for 2023 as well.
Hey, special offer. Well, that's marvelous. Jad, thank you ever so much. Most interesting talk, and lots of marvelous information about how women begin to come into the world of writing. And thank you all for coming and attending and listening. And thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all.